Milton is dead. Shakespeare is dead. And I'm not feeling very well myself. I don't know how old he was when he said that. I do know that he was 74 when he died. I just turned 84, so imagine how I feel. Just pray that I get through the next hour, and I promise I won't make any Mark Twain comparisons. I want to start out with a little quiz. These questions are from a survey the Roper organization conducted several years ago to find out what graduating seniors at 20 of our top universities, I'm talking Princeton, Yale, Harvard, Southern California, to test what they know about American history. Here's the first question. Let me figure out how to run this. Oops, how do I get to the first slide, Tim?
Hold on a second.
Well, the first question is, while Tim tries to fish it out, security alert, oh my.
Okay, that says a lot.
It says a lot about the environment we're in, right.
Okay, try now.
Okay. Who was the American general at the Battle of Yorktown? You know, this was the decisive battle of the American Revolution. Anyone know the answer? Washington, right. Only 2 out of 5 got that one right. Here's the second one. Who is the father of our Constitution? Nope. Madison. Well, barely. She hears this stuff all the time, so her answer doesn't count. Only 1 out of 4 got that one right. By the way, I want to thank Judy Parr for teaching me how to do PowerPoint. You know, I grew up with, chalkboards and flip charts like most of you did. And I just learned PowerPoint a few years ago, but once you get the hang of it, it's pretty cool. Next question. Who wrote Government of the People, by the People, and for the People? Nope. I didn't hear it. Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln. It's the closing line of his Gettysburg Address. We hereby highly resolve that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. One more. What founding document establishes the 3 branches of government? Constitution, right. Only 1 out of 3 got that one. And can anyone tell me what the 3 branches are? Executive. Fred, you're doing fine. Fred. Judicial. And legislative. Executive, judicial, and legislative. Right. Only 1 out of 3 got that one right. So you actually did better than the students. Now, in the same survey, the students were questioned on their knowledge of pop culture. You want to know what the results of that were? I don't think you do either. 99% knew who Beavis and Butthead were. 98% identified the rap singer Snoop Dogg. So the question we have to ask ourselves is this. What does this ignorance of our history, these are graduating seniors at our top universities, what does their ignorance of our history bode for the future of our democracy. I think of Santayana's famous quote, "If we ignore the past, we're condemned to repeat it." A few months ago, Marilee and I were in Berlin, and we went through a museum that sits on the site of the former SS headquarters there. And we saw an exhibit in the museum that depicted how the Third Reich came into power. And what struck me as I looked at the pictures of the SS roundups and read the captions, what struck me were the parallels between what happened in Germany in the 1930s and what's happening here today. I think of Hitler's brown shirts, for example, and the people who attacked our Capitol on January 6th. I think of the Gestapo roundups of the 30s and 40s and the ICE raids in our cities, Washington, D.C., Los Angeles, even Chicago in the last week or so, and the ICE raid at the Hyundai factory in Georgia a few weeks ago. If we ignore the past, we're condemned to repeat it. Before I get carried away on that, I want to say a word about the title I picked for this talk. The title is Jesus and Thomas Jefferson. I stole the title from this book, Jesus and John Wayne, by Kristen Kobus Dumais. I know a number of you have read this book. We read it in our Gentlemen of a Certain Age group a few years ago. Jesus and John Wayne, How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation. If Thomas Jefferson could come back and see what we're going through today, I think he would appreciate this book, which gets us into our subject of the day, the Declaration of Independence, which he wrote. Here's the original printed copy. I think 8 of these still exist. Next year, on the 4th of July, we'll be celebrating the 250th anniversary. That is, if we still have a functioning democracy, and I think we will. But we'll be having the anniversary of this document. It's also what I wrote about in this book, Miracle on Chestnut Street. This is a young adult version that came out a few months ago, but grown-ups can read it too. Miracle on Chestnut Street, The Untold Story of Thomas Jefferson and the Declaration of Independence. It's about the 16 months in his life that led up to his writing the document. By the way, I put some copies on the table in the back of the room. Feel free to take one, pass it on to your kids or grandkids. If you feel compelled to pay something, you put a few bucks in the collection plate. The proceeds will go to Community Action House. Otherwise, just take one. So, why Chestnut Street? Chestnut Street was the address of the Pennsylvania State House in Philadelphia, where the Declaration of Independence was signed. Today we call it Independence Hall. This is what it looked like in Jefferson's day. The miracle is how it came about in the first place. If you think Congress was divided today, you weren't in Philadelphia in the State House in the summer of 1776. So what I want to talk about today first is how Jefferson came to write this document. Then I want to talk about what inspired it. Here we'll get into his religious views. It's where the Jesus part comes in. Then we'll look at how relevant his ideas are today. If you'll indulge me for a minute, I want to read the description on the back. Hon, would you mind getting a glass of water for me? I forgot to bring one. That would help. Thank you. This is the back cover of the book. I'm just going to read part of it, starting with the second paragraph. Tom Jefferson, a young plantation owner from Virginia, was the least likely member of the Second Continental Congress to make a name for himself. When he arrived in Philadelphia in 1775, it was by default. He had been sent there as a substitute for a distant cousin. He resented having to leave his sickly wife and young daughters at home where they needed his attention. Most of all, he disdained politics. Yet we associate Jefferson's name more than any other with what happened on the most important day in American history, July 4, 1776. Notwithstanding many other defining moments in our nation's past, Appomattox, Pearl Harbor, the Apollo moon landing, 9/11 to name a few, thank you, honey. The Declaration of Independence that Jefferson wrote and the Continental Congress adopted on that date symbolizes more than any other event what America stands for as a nation. Now, for the first time, the story of that historic event is told from Jefferson's point of view. And I'm going to skip to the last sentence of that paragraph. It's the story of how a young man entered the world stage through the back door and how the ideas he expressed in that document still resonate in the 21st century. Now, it's easy to be cynical about that. But because of all the hatred and discord and incivility that surround us today, I say we step back a bit and remind ourselves just what Jefferson and his contemporaries stood for. What brought them to Chestnut Street? What ideas and principles did they stand for? What united them? Why did they create the United States of America in the first place? So my focus will be on Jefferson's ideas and where they came from and how they come through to us, not only in the Declaration of Independence, but in some other things he wrote, and why they're so important to us today. Jefferson, like Dylan Thomas in the movie, was a complete unknown when he arrived in Philadelphia in 1776. He was 32 years old. He had served a few terms in the Virginia House of Burgesses, but hadn't distinguished himself in any way except for a paper he wrote called A Summary View of the Rights of British America. This is what it looked like, not the sexiest cover. He wrote it in 1774 before the first shot was fired at Lexington, but when the early rumblings of the American Revolution were beginning to take place. Now, Jefferson intended this to be a working document, resolutions, he called them, for the Virginia delegates that were going to Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. We're talking September of 1774. Jefferson wasn't a delegate himself, but he wrote this paper to justify the stand he wanted his colony, Virginia, to take on the issue of tariffs. Doesn't that sound familiar? Tariffs the British were imposing on trade between the American colonies and countries outside the British Empire. There were other issues too, but they all boiled down to taxes the British were imposing on the colonies. Taxes they felt were unjustified. Jefferson was only 31 when he wrote this paper, and he wasn't yet a delegate to the Congress, although he was a member of the House of Burgesses. Still, he had the audacity to write it, and he argued that because the colonists who had come from England to this continent had submitted voluntarily to the authority of the British Parliament, the key word here is voluntarily, they could, if they chose to do so, separate themselves from that authority. In other words, what was freely given could be freely taken away. It wasn't a matter of sedition or rebellion, but a matter of dissolving the relationship that had been continued by their own will. Now, this was unique in the history of the British Empire. At that time, it encompassed about a third of the world's population. You've all heard the expression, the sun never sets on the British Empire. Through the years, there had been internal uprisings of one kind or another that had been put down. But this was the first time in the history of the British Empire that the Parliament or the Crown had to deal with open rebellion by any of her colonies. Now, in this paper, a summary view, Jefferson was careful not to condemn the king. Instead, he directed his criticism at the Parliament, and he had good reason for doing that. He probably would have been tried for treason if he had gone after the king, but he's still pretty outspoken. Here's an example, and this is toward the end of his paper. How do I advance this? Whoop.
Okay, here. Now I've got to close it and restart.
Yeah, this is it. This is toward the end of the paper. Can His Majesty thus put down all law under his feet? Can he erect a power superior to that which erected himself? He has done it indeed by force, but let him remember that force does not give right. Kings are the servants, not the proprietors of a people. And this is the clincher. Let not the name of George III be a blot on the page of history. Does that strike a chord or not? Well, you can imagine the impact this had on Jefferson's compatriots. His cousin, Peyton Randolph, who presided over the House of Burgesses, had the paper printed in Williamsburg, and later it was printed in Philadelphia. Eventually, a copy found its way to England, where Parliament listed him in a bill of attainder. It's like an FBI most wanted list. Can't you see Jefferson's picture in the post office? What it amounted to was a criminal indictment for treason. Anyway, after he wrote this paper, he set out on horseback from Monticello, his home in Virginia, to Williamsburg, the capital, with the paper in his saddlebag. The Virginia Convention was about to meet in this building, the Capitol in Williamsburg, where the House of Burgesses met, to elect delegates to the First Continental Congress. You see the British Union Jack on top. What happened was after he set out on the road, he came down with dysentery. Remember, he lived in a 3-mile-an-hour world, and he was on horseback. It's about 120 miles from Monticello to Williamsburg, so it probably took him 3 days to make the trip. So what did he do? He turned around and went home. Now, historians argue about a lot of things, and some of them are pretty dumb. In this case, why did Jefferson come down with dysentery? Well, there are a couple of theories about this. One is that he got so worked up writing this paper that it literally made him sick. The other theory is that his wife was ill after giving birth to their second child, and the baby wasn't doing all that well either. I think it was Jefferson's stress over that, not the paper he wrote, that made him sick. Or there may have been some physical reason, we don't know. Anyway, after he got home, he made 2 copies. Remember, he had to do this all by hand. There weren't any, scanners or fax machines then. One copy he sent on to Peyton Randolph, who was to preside at the convention. The other copy he sent to this guy, Patrick Henry, a fellow Burgess from the county next door. Well, true to form, Patrick Henry lost his copy. He may have been a great orator, but he was slovenly, disorganized, didn't smell very good. He was kind of a hayseed type from the backwoods. Jefferson once called him the laziest man for writing I ever knew. To tell you the truth, I think he was a little jealous of him. Patrick Henry studied the law for 6 weeks and passed his bar exam. Jefferson studied the law for 4 years under a man named George Wythe in Williamsburg before he felt he was ready to take the bar exam. So here he is giving his famous speech, "Give me liberty or give me death," at St. John's Church in Richmond, Virginia, March 23rd, 1775. If he were living today, he'd probably be an ambulance chaser. "Hey, call me, Patrick Henry, 1-800. He had the gift of gab, and that's why we remember him today. So, back to Williamsburg. When Peyton Randolph got Jefferson's paper, he read it to the delegates at the convention, and then, being the proud uncle he was, he was his mother's cousin, but he was more like an uncle to him. Randolph had it printed so everybody in Williamsburg could read it. This is Peyton Randolph. He ended up presiding at the First Continental Congress before John Hancock took over. If you'll indulge me again, I want to read my description of Peyton Randolph. The setting is the Virginia Convention in Richmond. And this is how I describe him. A man of enormous bulk. Is his picture still on the screen? Peyton Randolph had a great stomach, which doesn't really show much there. The artist was complimentary. He had a great stomach and a massive red face that seldom smiled or frowned. The 50-mile trip from Williamsburg had been an ordeal for him. When he spoke, he sounded like an expiring balloon. Turned out he died of a stroke. never made it to the Second Continental Congress. Otherwise, it would probably be his signature we would see at the bottom of the Declaration of Independence, not John Hancock's. It's one of those quirks of history. Jefferson's paper also got printed in Philadelphia, so even though he didn't make it there himself, at least the first time around, it was this paper that established his reputation as a writer, someone who could articulate the colony's case against the British Parliament. Fast forward to June of 1776, when Congress finally takes up debate on the Declaration. Jefferson is a delegate now, after taking Peyton Randolph's place. He's appointed to a committee charged with drafting a declaration to spell out the reasons for it. He's 33 now, still pretty young, and he finds himself on this drafting committee with two heavy hitters. You see Ben Franklin there on the left and John Adams in the middle. Now, Ben Franklin would have been the logical choice to write the Declaration or to draft it. He was the most revered member of the Congress. He had a long-established reputation as a writer. For years, he had put out Poor Richard's Almanac. But again, things that seem so inconsequential at the time can influence the outcome of history. It turned out Franklin had an attack of the gout that kept him home in bed. If dysentery doesn't get you, the gout will. So the choice of who was going to write the Declaration came down to Adams and Jefferson. Years later, Adams described how Jefferson urged the job on him, but he refused. But at least he wanted to get the credit for getting Jefferson to do it. This is the conversation as Adams recalled it years later. Jefferson, why will you not write it? Adams, reasons enough. Jefferson, what can be your reasons? Adams, reason first, you are a Virginian, and a Virginian ought to appear at the head of this business. Reason second, I am obnoxious, suspected, and unpopular. You are very much otherwise. Reason third, you can write 10 times better than I can. So, I think this dialogue reveals more about Adams than it does about Jefferson. At any rate, Jefferson went to work on it. Here's a draft in his own handwriting. You'll notice in the second paragraph, he writes, we hold these truths, originally he wrote, we hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable. That got changed to self-evident, and we'll see a bit later how that got to be changed. Show a film clip a bit later. So he wrote this in his apartment while Congress debated the motion on independence. Now, what isn't commonly known is that the resolution, that is the act of independence, passed not on July 4th, but on July 2nd. That is really the true Independence Day of our country. It was Jefferson's job to justify it, to give it a philosophical foundation. So what did he say in that document? I want to focus on the second sentence in the Declaration because I think it's the most important one. This is it. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, in writing these words, Jefferson said he turned neither to neither pamphlet nor book. What he tried to do was simply express the prevailing view in the Continental Congress on the subject of natural rights and the colony's relationship to the mother country. My object, he said, and I'm quoting from the foreword, my object was not to find out new principles or new arguments never before thought of, not merely to say things that had never been said before, but to place before mankind the common sense of the subject in terms so plain and firm as to command their assent. So the ideas he expressed were not just his. Here we get into the roots a little. Where did these ideas come from? Well, we can trace the origin of the Declaration of the ideas it expresses to the 13th century, specifically to this guy, St. Thomas Aquinas. Looks like he has his hands full there. I don't know where he got that haircut. Looks like a halo. Anyway, Thomas Aquinas, before he became a saint and got a real halo, brought a religious perspective to the ideas of Aristotle and the Stoic philosophers, who believed that there was an unchangeable natural law that pertained to the human race as well as to the universe. Aristotle said that man had a natural inclination to be just. St. Thomas Aquinas took this a step further and said, and I quote here, there is an inclination in man to the good, according to the rational nature which is proper to him. As, for example, man has a natural inclination to know the truth about God and to live in harmony in society. Well, then in the 17th century, 400 years later, along comes Sir Isaac Newton. You see him there with the apple next to his head, who wrote a book called Principia Mathematica, in which he tried to prove that everything that happened in the universe, all the movements of the planets and stars and so forth, happened in harmony, that there was a cause and effect relationship, that for every action there was an equal and opposite reaction, that there was balance, that there was harmony, and that therefore the entire universe, the physical universe, was subject to rational inquiry, like the law of gravity. Every object in the universe attracts every other object with a force proportional to its mass. Remember, years ago, we have a son who lives in Krakow, Poland, and we were there in the winter and made a side trip to a little town in the mountains called Zakopane. And our grandson, who was about 5 years old at the time, slipped on the ice, skinned his knee, got up and said, "It was Newton's fault." Never so proud as I was at that moment. Well, then another Englishman comes along, John Locke, the contemporary of Newton's, looks a little emaciated here. And he says, okay, so natural law governs movements of the universe. Isn't this also true of human relationships? And what is the role of government? What is the role of government? But to preserve that relationship of harmony, of balance, of justice. Think about that for a minute in light of what we're going through right now. I want to read something from Locke's essay on civil government. think this is the right book. Talks about what state all men are naturally in, and that is a state of perfect freedom to order their actions and dispose of their possessions and persons as they think fit, within the bounds of the law of nature, without asking leave or depending upon the leave of any other man. A state also of equality, wherein all power and jurisdiction is reciprocal, no one having more than another. A criminal who, having renounced reason, the common rule and measure God hath given to mankind, hath, by the unjust violence and slaughter he hath committed on one, declared war against all mankind. Well, imagine the impact this had at a time when George III exercised his tyranny over the colonies. The colonies regarded this as an attack not just on themselves, but on all mankind. The idea goes back to Cain and Abel. Cain, after he kills his brother, cries out, "Everyone that finds me shall slay me." He was convinced that everyone now had the right to slay him. An eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. My point is to show how this idea of natural law, which John Locke defined in terms of civil government, found its way into the Declaration of Independence. I also want to mention this guy, partly because of where we live, and where the first thing you ask a stranger in town is, what church do you go to? John Calvin. When I see this picture of him, it makes me glad I went to Hope. Hope I'm not offending any Calvin graduates. Jefferson, as you might imagine, was not a great fan of John Calvin. But Calvin did have a view that even Jefferson thought was advanced for his time. Remember, we're talking 16th century. In his Institutes, Calvin makes a statement to the effect that while kings derive their power from God, if a king acts or directs an act that is contrary to the will of God, think of this in terms of immigration and the Tower of Babel story, where the king says, build this tower so everyone stays under my control, and God says, no, go forth and multiply and inhabit the earth. His subjects have a right to defy the king. That seems pretty lame today, but in Calvin's time, that was pretty radical. Then John Locke comes along and says, man by nature is free, and society is governed by the laws of nature, and that society, like nature itself in its natural state, is balanced, is just, and that the laws of nature also apply to the conduct of human affairs. Now I want to zero in on two phrases in the Declaration of Independence. First, this one. Oop, did we lose it again? Oh, okay. All men are created equal. This view derived from natural law. It's the most fundamental principle in the Declaration, and it's one that has a profound theological implication. Jefferson didn't say simply that all men are equal. It's not our economic condition that makes men equal. It isn't our social relationships, our place in society that makes men equal. Look at the caste system in India, for example. Rather, we are equal because the God who made us created us equal. This isn't a legal doctrine. It isn't a social or political doctrine. It's a theological doctrine. All men are created equal. All of us are equal under God. All of us are born equal and are therefore entitled to basic human rights, such as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now you may ask, how can a man who wrote the man who wrote these words own other human beings? Maybe we can get into this in our Q&A. I hope we have time for that. But let me just say for now that this was a conundrum for Jefferson. It obviously posed a moral conflict for him. But given the time and place in which he lived, he was never able to resolve this conflict. But you can talk more about that later. The other phrase I want to get to is this one: the pursuit of happiness. This is one of the inalienable rights that Jefferson spells out. What did he mean by that? John Locke used the word property, life, liberty, and property. He said it was the government's right to protect property. So what did Jefferson mean by the pursuit of happiness? For this, I want to borrow a transcript of an interview that Bill Moyers did with Mortimer Adler on PBS. I don't have a date on this. It was a few decades ago. But I think the ideas are as relevant today as they were then. He breaks down the pursuit of happiness into 7 categories. These are the first 4. And he says these are things that government can't do or can't provide, things that we must provide for ourselves. First one he calls goods of the body. By that he means health, vigor, the pleasures of sense. Everyone, he says, needs health, a certain amount of vigor and sensual pleasure. The second one he calls goods of the mind. You've got a mind, he says, able to know, hence it needs knowledge, understanding, a modicum of wisdom. The goods of character, such aspects of moral virtue as temperance and fortitude, together with justice in relation to the rights of others and the goods of the community. Finally, the goods of personal association, such as family relationships, friendships, love. These 4 things, he says, are largely within our own power and can only be indirectly facilitated by what government does. So what is the role of government? Adler says government not only can provide, but must provide, in fact, is obliged to provide the next 3 things to facilitate our pursuit of happiness. First one, political goods, such as peace, both civil and external, political liberty, together with the protection of individual freedom and the prevention of violence, aggression, coercion, or intimidation. Second, economic goods, such as a decent supply of the means of subsistence, living and working conditions conducive to health, medical care, opportunities for access to the pleasures of sense, the pleasures of play and aesthetic pleasures, opportunities for access to goods of the mind through educational facilities, and enough free time from work to take full advantage of these opportunities. Finally, social goods, such as the quality of status and opportunity of treatment in all matters affecting the dignity of the human person. I don't know if you agree with him on all these things, but there's certainly food for thought. I remember reading in the Chicago Tribune a letter from someone who had seen this interview, who said Mortimer Adler should go back to running planetariums, but I think he got his Adlers mixed up. Anyway, there are so many things we can talk about in the Declaration of Independence, but I want to get away from that and talk about something else. I'm just curious, how many of you have ever visited Monticello? Jefferson's home. No, a few of you have. How many of you saw the family graveyard? It's way in the back of the house. And a few of you, okay. In that graveyard, you'll find this tombstone that Jefferson designed himself, along with the inscription. And it reads as follows: "Here was buried Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence, author of the Statute of Virginia for Religious Freedom, and father of the University of Virginia." Those are the three things he wanted to be remembered for. Notice he doesn't mention that he was the third president of the United States, or that he was responsible for the Louisiana Purchase or anything like that. It's the Statute of Virginia for Religious Freedom that I want to talk about for a minute, because I think we overlook that today as one of his major accomplishments. He wrote it in 1777, the year after the Declaration of Independence. But it didn't become law until years later. Meanwhile, he had written a book called Notes on the State of Virginia, in which he described some of the laws that pertain to the practice of religion in Virginia. I want to read a passage from that book. It's the only book he ever published, by the way, in which he describes some of the punishments. If a person brought up, this is colonial law in Virginia from the 1700s, early 1700s. If a person brought up in the Christian religion denies the being of a God or the Trinity, or asserts there are more gods than one, or denies the Christian religion to be true, or the scriptures to be of divine authority, he is punishable on the first offense by incapacity to hold any office or employment, ecclesiastical, civil, or military. On the second offense, by 3 years imprisonment without bail. The father's right to the custody of his own children being founded in law on his right of guardianship, this being taken away, they may, of course, be severed from him, his kids, and put by the authority of the court into more orthodox hands. That was Virginia law in the colonial period. It was because of laws like this that Jefferson introduced his bill to establish religious freedom. And this is how it reads in part. "Be it therefore enacted by the General Assembly that no man shall be compelled to frequent or support any religious worship, that all men shall be free to profess and by argument to maintain their opinions in matters of religion, and that the same shall in no wise diminish, enlarge, or affect their civil capacity." Remember the big hullabaloo when John F. Kennedy ran for president because he was a Catholic? I mean, Joe Biden was a Catholic. Did we make a big deal over that? I want to think we made a little progress on that front. The Supreme Court ruled against prayer in the public schools years ago. Yet the House and Senate both have chaplains, and every session of Congress opens with prayer. Our coins still say, and dollar bills, if you take them out of your wallet or purse, they still say, "In God we trust." So go figure. On the other hand, that probably isn't all bad, because we need all the divine help we can get. At any rate, the Statute of Virginia for religious freedom was the first legal act anywhere in the history of the world that mandated the separation of church and state. That was in 1786. Then a year later, in 1787, it was incorporated into the First Amendment. As for Jefferson's religious beliefs, I think it's fair to say that he believed in the teachings of Jesus, if not his divinity. At one point, he compiled a book of Jesus' sayings, the so-called Jefferson Bible, put a lot of work into this, in which he arranged all of Jesus' sayings by subject. And then when he was in his 80s, he wrote a letter to Dr. Benjamin Waterhouse, a prominent doctor in Boston, where he summarizes, if I can find it, can't find the book, where he summarizes the doctrines of Jesus. Somehow the book disappeared. But the summary is that Jesus was all good, that if we followed his teachings of how to treat one another, this world would be in much better shape than it is today. So, there you have it. The thing to remember is that Jefferson wasn't opposed to the practice of religion. He was opposed to the politics of religion and to sectarianism. His position, and it was entirely consistent with natural law, was that the state could not interfere with individual freedom, which included the exercise of one's religion. I want to allow some time for discussion. We have about 5 minutes. But I want to close with another letter that Jefferson wrote in 1800 to another physician in Philadelphia, Dr. Benjamin Rush. And it's inscribed inside the Jefferson Memorial in Washington, D.C. If you forget everything else I said in the last 50 minutes, just remember this. I have sworn upon the altar of God eternal hostility to every form of tyranny over the mind of man. I want to wrap this up by showing you a clip from Inventing America. This is the show we filmed at DeWitt Theater for PBS 10 years ago now, where Jefferson reads his draft of the Declaration of Independence to Adams and Franklin. And Franklin challenges Jefferson on the complex structure of his first sentence. And then we'll talk about that after we see the clip.
I buried myself in those rented chambers there on the corner of 7th and Market Street in Philadelphia. And there I wrote out the first draft of our Declaration of American Independence. Here, I have it.
Could we go back to the moment that you read the first draft to Mr. Adams and Dr. Franklin?
It was in late June, 1776. When, in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation.
I challenge you to diagram that sentence.
May I continue?
I'm sorry. Please do.
We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Strike sacred and undeniable. No, it's too dogmatic. Besides, it's obvious.
Is that the word you want? Obvious? We hold these truths to be obvious.
Are you familiar with Euclid's Elements?
I read them in school, but...
Things that are equal to the same thing are equal to each other. Euclid's first axiom. All of mathematics, he said, is based upon axioms, truths which are self-evident. May I see that? All men are created equal. Is that not also self-evident? We hold these truths to be self-evident. Yes, let that be our axiom. Self-evident?
Self-evident.
Self-evident it is, then.
Okay, someone who did take up Ben Franklin's challenge was Judy Parr. First one to ever do it. Now, Judy, I had hoped that she would be here. She came down with COVID or tested positive several days ago, so she's home. Watching at home, Judy. Wish you were here. This was going to be the highlight of the presentation, but since she isn't here, I'm going to read what she sent me, and I'm going to read this. I don't know how many words are in the first sentence, but what she writes here, the sentence exceeds the Twitter limit of 280 characters. Wouldn't even fit on Twitter. The sentence is complex, with the main clause being respect requires. It begins with when, an adverbial clause, and contains other subordinate clauses, quote, which have connected, and to, quote, to which the laws, which are adjective clauses. The clause, quote, that they should declare is a noun clause, which serves as a direct object of the main clause. The sentence also contains two infinitive phrases and several prepositional phrases. You follow that? Even if this sentence were read aloud to them, many Americans, including our president, would likely find it an immense challenge to our shortened attention spans. So thank you, Judy, and that wraps up our talk, and I think we're out of time.
Thank you to Milt. You can see why so many of us are Milt's fans, admiring not only his knowledge of history and his passion for writing, but also his entrepreneurship in bringing together these projects and these productions. I'm just kind of in awe of what Milt has accomplished. Next week, return and we'll have two sessions led by Douglas Brower on the art of pilgrimage. The first session will be about pilgrimages he has made. The second session will be a panel of people talking about their pilgrimages, and maybe some of us can think about significant pilgrimages we've made in our lifetime too. So come back next week, the art of pilgrimage. Thank you, Milt.
Thank you, David. I lost the book I was going to quote from. It disappeared.
Maybe it's in the